and talk about it. It was a good place to end. But like I said, this is not going to be as long as last week's show. I'm going to try not to breeze through it, but it's I think just enough to make you want to come back next week, because we're going to talk about these two events in great detail. Some of it will be a regurgitation of things that we've talked about. There are some new things that we can add to it. But in any way, and in any event, so last week when we talked, we discussed how Antonio Papalia immigrated to Canada and slowly took over the Rackets. It was a slow, methodical transfer, but one thing that Antonio Papalia did, which was different from, say, Perry, was that he expanded into areas that Perry didn't want to or just didn't see as a valued opportunity or commodity. Perry, who was more or less, pushed people out of his way and sort of attempted to contain his power in Canada, begins to lose it because his main power base, or the power that he had, was waning. The one facet that he absolutely made a mistake on was disrespecting Papalia. It sort of made the opportunity ripe for Papalia to branch out, to make friendships and business relationships that could avail him in a power grab if he chose to do it, which is what he would do. And that's essentially what ends up happening, is the Papalia makes inroads into New York with Stefano Magaddino, who had wanted Bagley to push into Canada. The problem that Magaddino likely didn't consider was how Joe Bonanno, who was Stefano Magaddino's cousin, would react to that. So while Papalia was keeping the ship in a straight line and consolidating more power, his son John was beginning to make waves of his own. As Antonio pushed outward, he brought as Antonio pushed outward, his sons, Frank, Rocco, Dominic, Joe, and Angelo, kind of get brought into the fold. And they began to handle his extortion rackets, his gambling dens, and controlling his interests in clubs all throughout Toronto. He then would bring his brother, he would then bring his brother-in-law, Anthony Polisi, Red LaBar, Freddie Gabbery, Frank Malchildon, and Jackie Weaver into the mix. The control of the Papalia crime family was flanked really by serious guys and loyal supporters, and the main income stream would be nightclubs and extortion rackets throughout Hamilton and Toronto. So Johnny Papalia was born in 1924. I was going to say he was a bastard child because he was born out of wedlock, but I don't want to go down that thing. But he was born in 1924 in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And even from a young age, he was sort of a chip off the old block. He would join youth gangs as a kid, and he would run with some very serious and infamous names that would become infamous. In 1943, Johnny Papalia would move to Toronto, which offered a bigger outlet for criminality, and he immediately finds a lot of success. He would join up with a group that specialized specifically in breaking and entering robberies. We're talking about warehouses, law offices, you name it, they could get into it, break the door down, or pick the lock and take the money. And while working with that crew, he would also meet and go to work for a guy by the name of Harvey Chernick. Chernick at the time was one of Canada's biggest heroin dealers. In 1945, Johnny would be arrested for burglary, but was able to plead it down to just a few months in the can. Then in 1949, Johnny would be caught moving small heroin capsules, and he would be arrested for that. He would be charged with heroin trafficking and would be sentenced to 2 years in prison for those actions. But at the trial, he was able to plead his case down from narcotics trafficking to simple possession of narcotics, which meant a hell of a lot less time in prison. And he was only able to plead that down because he explained that he wasn't a drug dealer, but that he had syphilis. And that was the only drug that he could use to treat the pain that was associated with syphilis. It's a brilliant fucking argument. The Canadian government, the Crown, had offered Papalia substantially almost no time. They said, listen, when plea hearings sort of began, they just said, listen, if you just tell us where you got the drugs from, we'll let you go. You won't even go to jail. But he refused to rat on anybody, which gave him a ton of street credibility. Could have made his life a lot easier, chose not to. He would head off to Guelph Reformatory for the next 2 years. So Papalia gets released in 1951, and then he would move to Montreal for a while to reestablish himself, to reintegrate himself into organized crime. Shortly after getting out, he would go to work with Luigi Greco and Carmine Galante, who had been sent to Canada on behalf of Joe Bonanno. What makes this move very interesting, and we've talked about it before, and I guess because we have new people that join every month to listen, it probably would serve everybody best if we rehashed just a little bit of information. So we know that Stefano Magaddino wanted to push into Canada, and Canada sort of becomes the battleground between Joe Bonanno and Stefano Magaddino. That was the real beef, and Bonanno wanted support from Magaddino, who wasn't willing to budge. And Magaddino also was not willing to support Joe Bonanno on the commission when it came to most of the votes. The guys wanted to do certain things. Magaddino just wouldn't back his own cousin. And Joe didn't really particularly like that. So the other issue between the two men was the turf split, because Magaddino owned a ton of fucking territory, right? He controlled just a ton of different areas. Magaddino's turf included Buffalo, upstate and western New York, Rochester, Utica, Amsterdam, eastern Pennsylvania, Youngstown, Ohio, and eventually he would spread into eastern Canada via Fort Erie to Toronto and then to parts of Montreal. That is a ton. He probably had legitimately the biggest area out of all the mob guys. He had the most fucking territory. The other side of the beef between the two was Magaddino's desire to push into Montreal. Bonanno sort of saw that Montreal as open territory, and who the fuck was Magaddino to stretch out even further when everybody could profit from moving to Montreal? And Bonanno would have a great argument in that. He really would, because when you consider just the totality of how much turf Magaddino had, you know, I could see the argument being, motherfucker, you have fucking 26 counties. I can't have fucking one. And then you're not even willing to sit down and let's split this up so everybody can make money. So I can see where Joe Bonanno would have a beef with that. I really can. Hold on one second, guys. I'm going to grab some water. All right. Much better. All right. So like I said, they were beefing over turf and territory and et cetera. And you have to understand at the time that Johnny Papalia was beholden to New York. The Papalias did not have enough power to hold out on their own. Sort of like Perry. He didn't have a big enough power base, so he had to spread out to other crime families in Canada for support, strength in numbers, that kind of thing. On the other side of that, Magaddino by nature was neurotic and nervous, and he begins to feel like Joe Bonanno is attempting to undermine him. And he believes that Joe Bonanno is spreading bullshit rumors about him in Montreal in an attempt to sabotage any ideas of Magaddino moving into Canada. So it's sort of like a small whisper campaign. Bonanno just starts saying things to the right people. Don't trust him. Don't this. So anybody that might have, say, made the choice to go into business with Stefano Magaddino isn't going to now. And that's what Magaddino believes. Now, whether or not that's true or not, I tend to believe it is, because that's kind of the guy that Joe Bonanno was. So one of the other concerns that Magaddino had was that he believed that Joe Bonanno was informing the police in Montreal about him. And this is likely why down the line, Bonanno would lie to everybody saying that Magaddino had him kidnapped in 1964 on the eve before Joe Bonanno was supposed to testify at a committee hearing. And we will talk a little bit about that next week, but that's exactly why Bonanno blamed him. He was trying to get him pinched. So there's obviously, bad blood between the two. But like we said earlier, Carmine Galante was sent to Montreal in 1953. At the time, Carmine Galante was a captain within the Bonanno crime family. He was sent there basically to take over the drug market in Canada and to absorb a couple of other rackets. Galante knew, like most other bosses, that affiliations and or working business relationships kept you safe. And what Carmine Galante does is he reaches out to Vic Catroni. And we will talk about the Catroni crime family in its entirety in a couple of weeks. But what he does is he aligns himself with Vic Catroni, and then he brings the Catroni crime family into the narcotics business into other rackets. It did a few things. Okay. Number one, it enabled the Bonanos to move around with partners that were strong. The Catrones had a lot of power, so it's a power-based move. It seems as everything in Canada historically has been reinforced by affiliations and business friendships. It just seems to be the way that the history sort of the trajectory of the history. Also, the reason for Carmine Galante to form an alliance with Catroni was there's two reasons for it. Number one, it offered a lot of protection, and it also offered business relationships because the Catronis had inroads with a guy by the name of Antoine D'Agostino. And Antoine D'Agostino was a French Corsican mobster based in Marseille, France, who had massive access to pure heroin. You have to keep in mind, this is before the drug routes were established. This is before Luchano sets everything up, okay? So Luigi Greco, one of Papalia's partners, quit school at the age of 10 and went to work for the Canadian Pacific Railroad shortly after his father died in 1923. By 1930, at age 17, Greco would take his first pinch for assault, which would be a common theme throughout his whole entire life. He would serve 68 days in jail for that. In 1932, Greco would take another pinch for robbery and 2 assaults when charged with resisting arrest. What happened in that particular case was that he had approached a woman. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when you're going to hit on a girl, there's certain ways of going about it. This guy had an entire approach which is very peculiar. He walks up to a woman and basically says, "You're beautiful. You're going to work as a prostitute for me." When she refused and was insulted, he punched her in the face, knocking her teeth out. Now, I'm not laughing at the violence of that because you should never put your hands on a woman ever. But it's like, oh, you don't want to be a prostitute? Okay. Bam. Just nutcase. A few days later, prior to that arrest, because he was arrested a couple of days after the fact, he had asked another man to purchase an illegal gun for him. And when that guy told him to go fuck himself, Greco beat him with a pipe. So Greco, you just don't say no to. Once arrested and charged, he would be sentenced to 6 months hard labor. In 1933, Greco would be arrested yet again. This time, Greco and his crew robbed a Canadian National Bank in St. Viateur and Park, and they stole $86,000. Police would recover all but about $4,000 of the theft, so obviously they weren't good at hiding the fucking money. 2 weeks after the robbery, all of them would be caught, including Greco. It was his 6th arrest in 2 years, and he would be sentenced to 11 years in prison. While Greco was in prison, he would meet a guy by the name of Harry Davis. Harry Davis was a big-time organized crime figure in Canada. And that's one thing I want to just kind of say for a second, is that I know when we talk about organized crime, right? You know, in America, it's all of these families. You have to think of Canada in terms of Andromeda, little cells all over the place. Not one family is more powerful than another, just little factions here, little factions here, little factions there, little factions over here. That's the way Canada operates. It's not going to be until the 1970s when the Rizzutos really come into power and they become really the fucking family in Canada. Because by that time they had pushed the Catronis out, went to war. But we're going to talk about all that a couple of weeks down the line from here. But I just want you to look at Canada as a bunch of little splinter cells. So even when the Papalias sort of come in and they start to organize, there's still other tiny little groups of 3 and 4 and 5 or 6 other guys that are doing stuff over here. So it's basically one big map and a bunch of little splinter cells, okay? And nobody is really totally in control as of yet. So through Harry Davis, Greco ends up meeting a guy by the name of Frank Petrula, okay? Greco would exit prison and he would begin working with a lot of different people, including Petrula and Davis. However, Greco's rise in the underworld would not become possible until 1946 when Harry Davis gets whacked in broad daylight by Louis Berkowitz. It's then that Greco and Petrula formed an alliance, and a lot of people throughout the years have said that Greco's the one that killed him. Kill him, take over his rackets. We've seen this a million fucking times. Can I prove it? No, but that's what people say. So in 1951, just to show you how powerful Greco was, okay? In 1951, Luigi Greco goes to Naples and he meets with Lucky Luciano. And it was widely believed that Greco meeting Luciano was all about narcotics coming from Italy into Canada and then into New York City. Luciano had wanted to get into the American market, as did Vic Catroni, who also traveled to Naples to see Luciano. So think about all of the people that Luciano would see. He's going to see Greco of all people, and he's going to see Catroni of all people. And once again, this is prior to those drug transportation routes getting set up. So when I talk about meetings coming up, it should kind of clue you in on where this is going to go. So anyway, Greco and Catroni head over to Naples and they see Luciano. And it was after Greco's return from Italy that he and Johnny Papalia hook up for business. Now, one of the questions that I often get is why Magaddino didn't go to war immediately with Joe Bonanno after he sends Carmine Galante to Canada. And the reason why he didn't was because Luciano was still in control of the fucking American Mafia all the way from Naples. And he had made the decision that the Bonanno crime family would be the family from American Cosa Nostra who had control of Montreal, which opens up a lot of different questions because we know that Luciano did not trust Joe Bonanno, but he almost had to in this instance. For whatever reason, I don't know why he didn't choose Magaddino to be the guy, but I think the fact that Carmine, basically Luciano says, I want the Bonanno crime family to be the representatives in Montreal. That's the way I want it to work. For whatever reason, that's the way he chose to do it. Keep in mind, Luciano at this point isn't exactly tight with the Papalias. Now that's going to change. But at the time, that's the decision that Luciano made. And if he's still the boss of bosses, you're going to do what he says. So without Luciano making that decision, you might have seen some serious shit go on. So when Luciano gives the word, that's why Carmine Galante was sent over there. Galante just didn't get on a plane because Joe Bonanno told him to. I mean, everything was signed off on. It wasn't, it wasn't just like Joe Bonanno said, oh, fuck it, this is mine and I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want. Go fuck yourself. It just didn't happen that way. Galante's main job was just to go the fuck over there and get ready to oversee the narcotics smuggling that was about to begin. Papalia ends up going to work for Carmine Galante, and he impressed Galante so much because he started off collecting extortion loans for him. Keep in mind, Papalia at this point is kind of running his own little crime syndicate, but they're not really formally recognized by the American mob. So what we typically see is Canadian guys will start to work for American crime families. And when he did, he impressed, think about it. He impressed Carmine Galante, who was a fucking raving lunatic. But he impresses him so much that he says, you know what? I could use you on some stuff. So from 1951 to 1956, the operation would be dubbed the French Connection. They made a killing in those 5 years. But first, in 1954, Papalia would use a lot of his illicit gains to fully take over a taxi company in Hamilton. Now, he would take some heat when one of his drivers, a guy by the name of Tony Copasotti, ends up getting whacked suspiciously behind the wheel of the car. And police always thought it was a mob hit. They always thought that Johnny Papalia had everything to do with that, but they could never fucking prove it. So the French Connection went on from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, okay? But we're only going to focus on a certain time period. And I don't want to regurgitate, like I said, the entirety of the French Connection, just because, we covered it with all the five families. However, really, the French Connection really went back to the 1930s, but they really didn't really start pumping shit out between the 50s and 60s. That was really the bulk of their wealth. That's where it came from. But anyway, Turkish farmers were licensed to grow opium poppies, and much of the excess that was left over was sold to the mob guys, the underworld figures. Once criminals got their hands on it, they would manufacture it into heroin and transport it to the United States. The heroin then would be made into paste in Corsican laboratories in Marseille, France. From Marseille, it would be sent to the U.S. and to Canada. So more or less, Marseille became the middle ground of the Mideast opium trade. Just reality. This is what the mob wanted with Cuba. They wanted Cuba to be a way station or a stopping point and the transportation lanes, okay? They were never able to obviously do that. But a lot of people suspect that all Cuba was a destination for gambling. No. The sole purpose and the only reason why the mob ever went to Cuba was, one, they could control them, but two, they wanted a hub in the middle of the fucking Caribbean for drugs. That's all Cuba was ever meant to be. So in the mid-1950s, probably, I think it was around 1955, Johnny Papalia would actually become a made guy, but not with the family you'd suspect. In fact, Johnny Papalia was approached by Stefano Magaddino about becoming boss of the Papalia crime family. So Magaddino reaches out and says, you know, we should recognize you as bosses of the family. And really the problem is it doesn't matter whether Magaddino wants to back Papalia. Johnny is taking over the crime family because he's already really done that, but he needs American representation, right? And his father had slowed up and pretty much allowed his sons to just take over everything anyway. So what Magaddino does is he inducts Johnny Papalia into the Buffalo crime family. Then he makes him the boss of Ontario and the new boss of the Papalia crime family. It's a very shrewd fucking move because he's not going to be recognized by American Cosa Nostra because he's in Canada. So Magaddino goes, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll induct you into my crime family. I'll tell everybody in New York, the commission, you're the boss of Ontario. It's a very, very fucking shrewd move. And Magaddino does it not only because he wants to keep his claws into Canada and specifically Ontario, but he knew that inducting Johnny Papalia into his family gave him arguing rights to parts of Canada. And he knew that Papalia was tough and he can handle the pressure. And it also does what? It fucks Joe Bonanno in the ass. And that's exactly what Magaddino wanted to do. So with Galante aligning with Vic Catroni, Magaddino felt that that would kind of, even things up, especially in Southern Ontario. I don't know if I specifically agree with that because you have the Catronis and you have the Bonannos, and now you have the Papalias and the Magadinos. So maybe it's evened out. Anyway, Magaddino expresses to Papalia that he didn't want him to be a bully in Ontario. I don't want you running around and acting like a mob boss. I don't want you acting like the motherfucking Pope. Here is what I want you to do, which is going to sound completely strange. But what I want you to do is I want you to be a consigliere to all of the old-time mob guys in Canada. I want you to be their support system. I want you to support other bosses and other little splinter cells and all of these little leaders in different areas. And I want you to serve as my enforcer type of boss. And I want you to accept the advice of other bosses in this area and do not fight them. And that's another fucking shrewd move because what Magaddino's telling him to do is, look, you're the power, but don't infuriate little splinter cells because his main fear was that these old timers would go running for the Catronis and the Bonannos. And now you got a problem. And all this is a big dick waving contest. That's all it is. But in telling Papalia of, you're going to be the guy who, if any of these other motherfuckers, any of these other little splinter cell bosses have, they're going to come to you and you're going to fucking handle business. So now he's going to get the respect of all of these outside little fringe groups. Basically, it's like the game of Risk. Okay, you're going to move your armies over here. You have to think, if anybody's ever played Risk, you understand how the game is played. You have a certain amount of territories on a map and you get a certain amount of men and you got to decide which areas are most important to you, and you're going to corral that whole area with your troops. That's just basically sort of a visual way of looking at it. And that's exactly what's going on here. And it's a very brilliant move. Anyway, not only does that enable Magaddino to keep his ears on the ground, but it also enables Johnny Papalia not to make enemies. And that's very important in this time period because now Montreal and Ontario is becoming a place that the American mob wants to take over and they want to control. So everybody's just kind of jockeying for position. And it was like, the Papalia taking over a crime family and using all the older bosses in the area as consiglieres. And what I said that wrong. He's acting as their consigliere. He's kissing their ass. He's the power. But if you're doing favors for all these other guys, they're going to align with you. And the more people you have backing you, the stronger you fucking are. This way, if if an issue comes up, you're going to have cross support for Magaddino and Papalia from all of these other little groups. And what ends up sort of happening is Papalia would fully control Hamilton, Oakville, St. Catharines, Wyland, Niagara Falls, and most of Toronto. He would expand into northern Ontario and controlling North Bay completely. By 1955, Papalia was the man in Ontario. There was nobody stronger than him. And in 1955 also was a huge year for Johnny Pops. He not only began collecting protection money from all the gambling between Hamilton and Toronto, but he would take over all of the vending machine routes in the area. And then he begins loan sharking between Hamilton and Ontario. He would also move headstrong into narcotics trafficking on behalf of the Magaddino crime family. He would then move on to shaking down a casino in Cooksville. That casino was the brainchild of two Toronto bookmakers, Joe McDermott and Vincent Feely. The problem was that they owned multiple casinos. And one of the casinos that they were running at the time, the one which Johnny Pops decides he wants to shake down, problem is they had silent partners. And those silent partners were the Detroit Mafia. So McDermott and Feely, after dealing with Johnny Pops' people, they call Detroit and they want Papalia dead. They want him fucking dead. Detroit looks into it and decides, rather than go to war, why don't we just bring Johnny Papalia in for a percentage of the cut? If Papalia promises to protect the casinos in return, which he agreed to do. It meant Detroit didn't have to meddle in that. They could just say, you know what, Johnny Papalia is already there. Let him handle whatever problems you got. And guess what they do? They all agree. So Johnny Papalia gets what he wants. Detroit gets what they want. And that's a very strong and significant move. So one of the things that Papalia does next is he pays the tax arrears from the Porcupine Miners Club of Timmins. And that was basically a social group for the miners in Northern Ontario, which was founded in 1929, that had been out of business for a ton of time. Papalia would use the right that he gained with social club charter to reopen the lodge, right, in 1955. And what does he do? He turns it into a cover for illegal gambling that operated for the next 2 years and made something like $5 million. What Papalia had done is he rigged the goddamn games, having the dice loaded to favor certain numbers, having small dents placed in the cards to help the dealers know when the cards, where the cards were, and clips were placed under the gambling tables to remove cards with high values. So he's cheating. It was a symptom of the money and power that he had. He could do whatever the fuck he wanted, and who's going to stop him? Johnny Papalia became so feared that he could essentially walk into any business he felt like owning and just explain how things were going to go. And anybody who refused to accept their new gracious co-owner or partner would find themselves hospitalized day later with fractures from head to toe. He didn't fuck around. It was either get in line or suffer my wrath. One of Papalia's more extensive yet lucrative shakedowns was going after stockbrokers who worked on Toronto's Bay Street. He would corner them, or he would send emissaries to extort $1,000 a week from them as protection, and they would tell them, we're going to protect you so that your enemies couldn't harm you. But in reality, it was protection from Johnny Papalia having them beaten senseless. So, once again, the police actually would eventually get involved in investigating Papalia for dozens of beatings that were taking place on people in the Hamilton area. But per the usual, the police couldn't get any of the victims to utter a word. And a lot of that was because people were scared that they would be killed in retaliation. So Papalia would then take the shakedown money, and he would put it on the street in the form of loan sharking. Papalia, who was also a huge fan of boxing, would establish one of the first underground bare-knuckle brawls, which brought him in a ton of money as well. And one of those boxers, a guy by the name of Howard Baldy Chard, would also act as an enforcer for debts that were owed to Johnny Papalia. So, along with his many contacts, he becomes close with a guy by the name of Tony Silvestro, who was one of these fringe bosses in Canada. And just so you don't get confused, like I said, there was always an organized crime element in Canada that wasn't totally established by one force. Like I said, splinter cells. And Silvestro really didn't come into a lot of power until Rocco Perry goes missing. And we can sort of juxtapose what we think he might have been involved in with that as well. Silvestro was involved in bootlegging, narcotics, and extortion. So with Silvestro's backing, remember, Johnny Papalia didn't control all of the areas in Ontario. Other parts belonged to people like Silvestro and some other little people. But in any event, with his backing, Johnny Papalia begins to open up charter gambling dens all over the place in Hamilton and in Toronto. Silvestro's son-in-law, the notorious Gianni Gasparini, they brought him in. They brought Danny Gasparini, and if you look him up, holy shit, this guy was a fucking maniac too. But not only did they bring in Danny Gasparini, but Johnny brings in his brothers Frank, Rocco, Dominic, Joe, Angelo, along with their brother-in-law, Tony Polisi, who was associated with Reg LaBar, Freddie Gabbery, like we said earlier, Frank Marchildon, and Jack Weaver. And they all worked inside those clubs, ensuring that they ran smoothly and without incident. Eventually, police would raid a lot of these gambling dens, and then Papalia would switch over to working back with McDermott and Vincent Feely in the gambling business. So he shook down their casinos. They had an agreement. He opens up a ton of gambling dens. The police raid everything. So what does he do? He turns right back to McDermott and Feely to get involved in more businesses, and then they all together begin to expand outward. So in early 1956, Papalia would contact a guy by the name of Alberto Egisi, who was a member of Magadino's, the member of the Magadino crime family. Albert, along with his brother Vito, were major movers within the heroin market. Through Albert, Johnny would make contact with Antoine Courtelane and Joe Cesari, and those two guys were the heads of a group called Les Milieux, Milleu. I don't say French, milieu. That's my French, which basically was the Corsican Mafia. And they controlled the drug manufacturing and everything that was going on there. In contrast, and we're going to teach you some stuff here I don't think anybody knew today, there were 19 Mafia families that were operating in France at this time. And just for reference, you ready for this? I'm going to give you all 19 names. They had the Francisci crime family, the Guerini crime family, the Orsini crime family, the Venturi crime family, the Carbone crime family, the Sardi crime family, the Mandoloni crime family, the Barbieri crime family, the Barisi crime family, the Campanella crime family, the Mariani crime family, the Casanova crime family, the Guzzelli crime family, the Pataccini crime family, the Hornick crime family, the Parletto crime family, the Zampa crime family, and the Zemmour crime family. So France was stocked with their own fucking 19 organized crime families in France. So there you go. I know you guys learned something from that. So Johnny Papalia reaches out to Courtelane and Cesari to buy high-quality heroin from them. They agreed. Papalia then had an issue. How does he smuggle it into Canada and then into the United States? Getting it is one thing, selling it's another. So what he does is he makes contact with Vinnie Morrow and Frank Caruso. Both were members of the Genovese crime family. Papalia needed somebody in New York who could sell the shit. Getting it? Fine, I'll get it. But once we get it from Canada to the United States, who's going to sell this shit for us so we can make some money? And he picks Vinnie Morrow and Frank Caruso, who are members of the Genovese crime family. Like I said, he wasn't worried about getting it there. It was just selling it. But the other issue was that he needed permission to do this. So he would send Albert Egisi to go see Stefano Magadino and with $4,000 in cash. And what he says is, here's $4,000 up front. I'm going to give you half of what we make on this cocaine that we're going to move, the heroin or whatever the drug of choice was. And Magadino says, beautiful, beautiful. You have my permission to move weight. So before the French Connection could get going, there were two meetings. And all of that drug deal was a setup. It was, let's see if we can do this. Let's see if this will actually work. And it worked. Therefore, they're starting to set things up, right? So like I said, before the French Connection could really fully get going to full capacity, there were two meetings that would need to take place in order to get things done. Those two meetings would be in Sicily and one in upstate New York, just 1 month apart from each other, in the year 1957. And that's where we're going to stop today because I really want to talk about these two meetings. And I'm going to tell you something. Guess who was at those meetings? Johnny Papalia, the only Canadian who was invited to both of those meetings. He was in the meeting in Sicily. He was in the meeting at Joe Barbara's house, Appalachian. He was at both, the only one. So that should show you the type of prowess and power that he had. So like I said, when we come back next week, we're going to talk about those two meetings and how it's going to change the trajectory of not only just organized crime, but it's going to completely overhaul and change narcotics rackets. These meetings would be absolutely huge. And Johnny Papalia was like I said, the only Canadian who was there, which shows you how important he was just about to be, not just to his own family, but to organized crime in general. So next week when we come back, we're going to get right into those two big meetings, and it's the further rise of Johnny Papalia. And so that's where we're going to stop today because these meetings we're going to talk about are going to be very familiar. One of them is the drug meeting in Sicily. The other one's going to be, Appalachian or Appalachian, however you want to say it. But we're going to cover these meetings in a little bit different kind of way. Yes, we're going to talk about the things that we've talked about before, all of the ins and outs and all of the bells and whistles, but we're going to talk about it from a Canadian perspective. And that's what is a little different about when we talk about this. So all of that being said, I'm sorry that this is a little shorter than last week, but I didn't want to get into the two meetings and then break away from it and then try to come back next week and be like, by the way, so we talked last week about these two meetings. I would rather just talk about the two meetings and then move forward because some shit's about to go down because not only is Appalachian bad for business, not only was the meeting in Sicily about drugs, but the transportation routes are still used today. We see Danny Kinahan, allegedly, still using these routes. So the routes that Lucky Luchano established while he was in Italy are still used by all of the major cartel movers and shakers today. And it would be interesting to see what Luchano would think about that. All of these years later, they're still doing the same shit in the same area. But what ends up happening, as we will see, is once the narcotics starts to move in, you're going to start having some problems and some serious beefs. Because every time that we have talked about the French connection and the drugs and the narcotics, we tend to focus on the 5 families of organized crime. And we don't focus on the Canadian side of that because we weren't covering them. But it's going to lead to the Rizzutos eventually. It's going to lead to the Catronis. It's going to lead to the Musitanos and all of these fucking other crime families who